Bruchim habayim. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Rabbi Heskel. I'd like to say Boker Tov. Obviously, if you're watching this early in the morning, or at least from where I'm at, the sun has just risen. Just got done davening Shachrit, and as you also see, just got done blowing the shofar. It is traditional in the morning time hours after Shachrit, after the reciting of Psalm 27, that we say during the month of Elul all the way up to the high holidays, to then blow the shofar, which is to sound the call to the Jewish community to do Teshuvah. It's actually to call everyone, not just for that matter, everyone who hears the shofar, even the non-Jewish world, to do Teshuvah. And one of the things I like to focus with you on here, a little thought, I mentioned this in a previous video I did, and this deals with concepts of Teshuvah that we've been talking about here, specifically Darchei Teshuvah. And one of the things I like to share here is from a book I've been reading during the month of Elul. And this book is called the Sefer Tomah Devorah, which means the book of the palm tree of Deborah. And it's attributed to the Ramach, Rabbi Moshe Choleveru. And what he did was he wrote this book based upon the idea of a person taking daily stock of himself, a daily cheshbon, self-accounting, and to do with Teshuvah, and mostly by looking at one's midot or attributes in comparison to God. You know, one of the biggest things that we recite on Yom Kippur is the Yu Gimel Midot, the 13 attributes that Hashem spoke to Moshe when he met him for forgiving the Jews for the sin of the Egel Zahav, the golden calf. And it's one of the things that actually is the primary focus on Yom Kippur. Actually, through all the sitters on that day, if you pay close attention, you'll notice there's a great emphasis on the Yu Gimel Midot, the 13 attributes of God. And there's a profound reason behind that, which I will share for a teaching I have for Yom Kippur. But nonetheless, the Ramach, what he did was he wrote this Sefer based upon learning to emulate Hashem, and therefore how that can mitigate judgment in one's life. It's a book that is studied by a lot of pious Jews, throughout the world. Some of them study on a monthly basis, and what he did was he wrote it based upon, you read basically a chapter a day, which corresponds to the day of the month. And so what I'd like to share with you is something that was from the other day. Today is now the 21st of Elul. I'd like to share something that he brought down on the 19th of Elul. And this could be the 19th of any month. It just happened to be reading in on the 19th of Elul. And this is in Perek Levi'i, this is in chapter 4. And I want to share something here about a thought when it comes to Teshuvah. And this is a very profound thought that the Ramach brought down. I thought is very interesting. And I'm going to abbreviate some of the areas. And he says, Eki kamo, shehat Teshuvah yesh bo shoresh cho hanimsaot. He says that you should consider that Teshuvah involves the returning of all beings to their shoresh, to their roots, which is Hamnimsa Besor HaYovel, which is considered the essence of the Yovel, or the Jubilee. Okay, if you don't know, in the Torah tells us that once the Jewish people, all the 12 tribes were in the land of Israel, there were a lot of territories. And if something would happen to those territories, or inheritance of those territories, let's say Shevet Yehuda basically relinquished something to Shevet Naphtali, to the tribe of Naphtali. Okay, and Naphtali, or family of Naphtali, remained in possession of something in the territory of Yehuda, or even an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave for that matter. Okay, the Torah talks about the Yovel is the year literally of release. That's what Yovel means, Jubilee. And so it's when all debt is forgiven, everything is completely forgiven, and everything has to go back to its original point of origin. And what the Ramach is talking about here with Teshuvah is something profound, is that really Teshuvah, the essence of it, like the Yovel, is a person being restored to an original point, to a restoration point. And this is something I like to stress here, that when people get this idea of Teshuvah, a lot of people don't know what they're doing. They go through rituals, and they're not really understanding the essence of those rituals, right? Why are they doing what they are doing? What does it mean? Teshuvah is not just simply, beating one's chest and saying, Kif Fashanu, I've sinned willfully, Ki Chatanu, I sinned against you, and I'm doing vidui, I'm doing a confession before you, God. That is a part of the process, don't get me wrong, but people get lost in the ritual. Rather, what we see here, Teshuvah, is about a person being restored to what they were created for. Why Hashem brought each of us in this world. And therefore, Teshuvah is about going back to the point of origin of why God brought us in this world. And therefore, he says it's really the secret that's in the Yovel, because when the Yovel comes, the greater Yovel, the Messianic millennium that we call it, that's a point of contact when the Bria, the creation, is going to be restored back to its original point. And therefore, he goes on to say afterwards, here, and this is something powerful, he says, Hanichala bikirusha besod hagivrot. And he says, what we see here is that when this happens, okay, the restoration point, we see here that the holiness and the essence of Givrot is rooted there, and therefore there's going to be a restoration in Givrot. And he quotes a pasuk, and I'm going to explain this here from Parsha Noach, that after the flood, Noach emerged from the ark, the Teva, and he offered a sacrifice before Hashem, in which the Torah says, Vayarach Adonai et reach haneroach, that Hashem, if you will, smelt the aroma, and it became satisfying. And this is an offering that we see associated with the Olah offering in the Torah, that God calls it a reach haneroach. Okay, it's a sweet aromatic fragrance to God. Not that he takes delight in the meat or anything, but in what the korban symbolically represents. And Olah represents an ascension. A person is ascending, trying to ascend higher to God in their thoughts, etc. In this situation, when he talks about the holiness of Givorah, first Givorah in Hebrew is a form of strength, like the word koach or chazak, but it means something deeper than strength. It's associated sometimes with judgment. It's associated when there's din, or judgment leashed in the world, and therefore God is perceived sometimes operating in what we consider masculinity, femininity, neuter gender, that the right side of God is symbolically represent what we call chesed, kindness. The left side of God is what we represent, givurah, din, midas hadin is called, or midas hachesed, the attribute of kindness or the attribute of judgment. And so what we see here is that he says that even in the aspect when judgment is on a person, in this case the entire world in the days of Noach, we see that even judgment can be sweetened. And it was something was acceptable to God after Noach left the ark, left the Teva, and therefore that judgment became sweetened. And he says likewise, he says, Chacha Adam besod teshuvato osei sodze. Basically, likewise, by means of the essence of Teshuvah, man also achieves this essence. How does man achieve this essence? In other words, when a man has judgment, mankind, an individual has a din against him, and he's experienced din. Obviously, the world experienced judgment. Noach experienced the also uncomforts of judgment as well. He didn't escape it. He was just saved from it. No one can escape the wrath of God. No one can escape the judgment of God. Okay, the difference is that you can be shielded from it, but you're going to experience it in some way, shape, or form. The world as Noach knew it was no more. There was no comfort and luxury that he had, but yet he was preserved, and the Torah tells us that he was an Isadik Tamim. He was a blameless, righteous man, B'dor Tav, in his generation. And the reason why, as I explained in another video, is that when the Torah mentions Eli Toledot Noach, instead of mentioning his sons there in that verse, it mentions him being righteous, in which Rashi says that instead of telling us the birth of his sons, it tells us that he gave birth to his righteousness. So even there, Noach's actions had to mitigate judgment even from his own life. Okay? And so the Ramach says here that, this is the essence of man, and therefore a person should not say, listen to what he says. He says a person should not say that basically Teshuvah only benefits aspects of holiness in man. In other words, a person who's considered a Sadiq, someone who's righteous on various levels, right? We're not talking about Mother Teresa, Sedechet, or the popes, Sadiq here. We're not talking about that image of righteousness that people falsify as righteousness as these saintly figures or something of that nature. What he's talking about here is, people who are not really flamboyantly evil or outrightly wicked. They make small mistakes. He says, don't think that Teshuvah only benefits those type of people. He says, no. He actually goes on to say over here, he said, today he says that you need to know, excuse me, I skipped ahead here. He says that you also need to know that evil aspects in a person also become rectified. They have a Tikkun as well. And he says the judgment even in a person who's considered a Rasha someone who's wicked, also becomes rectified. And then he goes to say, Tedash ha'arei Cain. He says, take a look about the example of Cain, of Cain. And he says, regarding Cain, Rachaya, he was a Rasha. We know the story about Cain. He murdered his brother Hevel, his brother Abel, right? When he was not satisfied that Hashem rejected his offering and accepted his brothers. And he says, V'nei Amar, as it says, lo, regarding him over there in Bereshit Dalet Zayin in chapter 4, verse 7, in which God told Cain, even after he committed the deed of being a Rotseach, a murderer, and even though he did that, God still was merciful, had mercy towards him. And what did God tell him regarding that act? God says, Halo im tetiv she'et. If you better yourself, it says you'll be uplifted. And the Ramach means over here, he says, El tachshov mipnei she'ata mitzah hara she'en lecha hatachna ze shecher. He says, basically, don't think, and this is the way he's interpreting what God told Cain, don't think that because you emerge from the side of evil, that there is no chance for you to experience a tikkun. Ze shecher, this is a false notion that's actually sowed into you by your Yetzer Hara. And he goes on to say afterwards, because halo in tetiv means, listen, you can actually better yourself, because you can implant within yourself the essence of Teshuvah and you will be uplifted. And so what the Ramak is saying here is that, hey, maybe you're an individual who considers himself hopeless at Teshuvah. You consider yourself a Rasha Gamor, a complete Rasha, a wicked individual. In this situation, we have an individual who did a very wicked and selfish deed, such as Cain. He murdered his brother, okay? And there was no legitimate reason why he did it. And yet Hashem comes to him and says, listen, don't think that you can't be uplifted. And just because you stem from evil does not mean that hope is lost. Now this is powerful because the Ramak goes on to explain something over here. And he says over here, he says that even evil actions themselves can be transformed by an individual into good. And therefore the deliberate transgressions, the avero, become transformed into zichut and merit. And this is, he's alluding to a passage brought down in the Talmud that talks about the two levels of Shuvah. Shuvah that's done me'ahava, out of complete love for God, is able to eradicate and erase every form of avera, major or minor, from the bria, from the creation, as if you never did it. Shuvah me'yira, on the other hand, which is the shuvah of fear, which is a shuvah that a lot of people do, that takes transgressions and basically demotes them. It makes them minor. So in other words, let me give the an analogy here. Imagine driving in your car, you're going down the highway, and you're flying like 50 miles over the speed limit. Clearly, that's enough for you to get your license revoked and to get your car towed away and to probably spend the night in jail and then have to go before the judge. So the police officer comes up to you and, clearly you're wrong, and clearly, he's in here. But what happens is when the police officer comes, asks you for your license or registration, asks you, what's wrong with you? Why are you flying 50 miles over the limit, doing like 120 something miles per hour? He sees you beating your chest. He sees that you have tears in your eyes. Maybe these are alligator tears, they're fabricated, and you're beating your chest, and the officer says, Machore, what's happening? And, and next thing you know, you say, officer, you say, Ani Metziyer, I'm so sorry, I'm doing slicha, I'm doing slicha, mechila, I'm asking for forgiveness for God, I'm asking you to forgive me for going over the limit. The officer is impressed, that someone's performing a religious ceremony before him, but he says, listen, you're not off the hook. So your teshuvah had enough influence on the police officer that when he goes back to his cruiser and checks your information out, pulls up your record like they do in the heavenly court on Rosh Hashanah, he says, okay, the individual has some small traffic, infractions, parking ticket here, parking ticket there, but nothing major. So he goes back and he says, listen, instead of me towing your car away, impounding it, putting you in jail for the night, suspending your license, this is what I'm going to do. He says, because you did shuvah, what I'm going to do is, instead of doing that, I'm just going to give you the maximum fine that you have to pay, and you're going to get points on your license. So in other words, you're not out the ticket, you're not out the judgment. This is what shuvah, miyira is. Shuvah done out of a fear. And there's various levels of fear. is what promotes and prompts a lot of people during the high holidays to get right with God. They fear losing income, they fear losing their job, they fear their health, etc. And so they try to make up by giving tzedakah, focusing on the prayers, be a little bit more attentive by attending services that they normally don't do during the year. And this is the outcome, all right? It's Teshuvah. Hashem accepts it, right? He accepts it. But it doesn't get you out the judgment, okay? It sweetens the judgment, okay? It sweetens it. However, the other shuvah that the Ramak mentions is brought down by Chazal, as that he talks about here, that averot, transgressions, that do have a stain, that when there's a shuvah done me'ahava, from out of love, what that does is God takes an eraser, and he goes back to that point of time when the individual sinned, whether that's a major sin or whether it's a minor sin. And because the individual is doing shuvah out of genuine love, not because of what I call strings attached, not because of wealth or materialism or worried about his own health and his life for that matter, but because he's concerned about his relationship with God. That what Hashem does, he takes his eraser and he takes the permanent stain of sin that was done in time and he just erases it from the fabric of Bria. I mean, it's almost like, imagine behind me, you see the Yam, the ocean, you see the clouds, right? As if all of a sudden you just saw like a magic eraser come and Hashem just starts erasing things like it was there a second ago and it's gone. That's literally what the Chazal talks about when it comes to Shuvah Me'ahava. When a person does a genuine Shuvah, it's erased. And it reminds me of a passage brought down, and also another passage in the Talmud where Chazal mentioned with a ger that when they undergo Girut, they go through their conversion, they are considered a newborn, in which they're born again. And even if that Gentile, before his gerut, before his conversion, was a murderer, was a pagan, was a barbarian, the moment they renounce that former deeds and confess to God their sin, which is done out of a form of a love like a child, Chazal says those sins never existed. So in temple times, when Israel was more settled in the land, let's say if a non-Jew from the neighboring nations was wanted for murder, right? They did something under their former pagan cult, right? And later on they did a shuvah and they come live in Israel, and the non-Jewish, agents of the non-Jewish nation find out where they're at, and they say, hey, we demand you to give that person over. They were a member of our nation and they committed this sin, they did that crime, and they're wanted for punishment, et cetera, et cetera. Well, according to Jewish law, the Jewish nation can't give that ger over. That's what he did back then. But he's a Bria Chadashah, he's a new creation. He's born again. And therefore, God forgives him of those sins, and you're not allowed to touch him, okay? Now, it's another situation if the individual does it after he comes to the faith in God, but we're talking about a situation where a person's sins are completely erased. And so, the Ramak mentions here that in this situation, this could have happened with Cain. And he says, because over there, he said, had Cain did a shuvah, he says over here, he says, Cain shav b'shuvah v'nichan. Had he done it, there could have been a tikkun, okay? There could have been a rectification. And he says, if he would have did that, he says, and guess what would have happened? Hine zidor adam harishon shebo holi et Cain. Then Adam sinned, the sin that Adam did, okay? In which Cain was conceived, would have been rectified. And he goes on to say, because the name Cain in Hebrew is derived from the name Kina Dimsa Avuta, which literally means a contaminated nest, like a contaminated bird's nest, okay? And he says, it would have been credited to Cain regarding rectifying his father's sin, as Chazal mentioned in Masechet Sanhedrin, Bara Mizachei Abba, that essentially what it says here, that the son brings merit, zechut, to his father. However, what the Ramak says here is what we know is that Cain did not do this to Teshuvah. He did not rectify the sin of his father, and therefore judgment came in the world. Now, something powerful here, what I want to explain this before I get to the conclusion here, is that when we read the Torah in Parashat Bereshit, we read narratives of the stories that it's very hard to comprehend from a physical level, right? The problem with interpreting those verses literal is that they bring up a lot of issues, right, in the interpretation, which we'll preserve for another time for Parashat Bereshit. But when we look at Cain and Hevel, right, we ask, where's their children at? Because we know Seth, when he was born, was in the image of his father, Adam. But yet, Cain and Hevel, They had no, where was their offspring, right? Or what was of them? Were they of another humanoid race? All these bring up questions. But what I want to point up here is something interesting, is that when the Ramach mentions in Hebrew that Cain's name is Kina, Dim Sa'avota, that he's a contaminated nest, okay, because he comes from his father Adam, we have to recognize that, yes, children are an extension of their parents. A parent's thoughts can be filled with impurity, and that can affect the sperm that then goes into the ovaries, and which eventually brings forth children. Okay, this is what we call hereditary inheriting things. Things are hereditary, or generational curses, or things of that nature. It's much more deeper than just something being biological. There's a spiritual connection to this. And so Cain, if you will, inherited Tumah from Adam HaRishon. Adam, we know, fell from the grace of God. However, he could have made a tikkun, he didn't. It was up to his sons to do the tikkun. They failed. Cain killed his brother Hevel. He had the chance to do Teshuvah, to do a tikkun. He didn't do it. Even though he was a Rasha Gamor, a complete wicked individual, he still could have did a tikkun. And so what we see here is that he could have brought merit. And what does that mean? Which means that it tells us no matter who an individual is and where they come from, it doesn't matter who your parents were, okay? Your parents, Chas Chalila, could have been Hitler, Yamach Shemo, okay? I'm using the most extreme here, that you could have been descendant of Hitler himself, of Russia, right? And yet, God will say to you, it doesn't matter if that's your father. The fact is that even if you come from evil, that evil could be rectified. So in other words, hope is not lost, even for an individual who maybe consider himself completely wicked and even unredeemable in the eyes of Hashem. The Ramach says that's shtuyot. Everything under the sun is redeemable. And he goes on to say over here afterwards, Shahadam mashrish be'atzmo sod hara tuchano. It says umach niso el hatov. And the season, he says, basically right here, the reason for this is, as I mentioned, a person can take the ra, the evil within him, and then plant it into the essence of it, sweeten it, and transforming it into the aspect of tov, of good. In other words, don't make an excuse for yourself. I didn't live up to the standards of Hashem. And once again, we're learning here with the Teshuvah, the Ramach is not identifying, just regular average people who make a few mistakes here and there, they got bad habits. No, we're talking about people who have severe roots of evil. And this is also something because how many people struggle with certain things that they may have inherited or certain things that they developed, right? People have a drug addiction. Maybe they keep it concealed, but it's a stronger drug addiction. Maybe a person has a lust addiction, with men or women. Who knows what it is? A person has some type of crazy addiction that they're struggling with. And yet it's a very strong form of evil that takes them over. They become a totally different person, possessed, if you will. Oh, Ramach says here, listen, if that's you, you could take that evil and it could be brought into good. And he goes on to say afterwards, it says that when a person, lefichacha adam metacher yetzer hara umachniso el hatov v'chu mishtaresh b'kirusha lamala. When a person purifies his yetzer hara and transforms it into good, he becomes rooted lamala, above b'kedusha, in holiness. This is powerful because he says when a person purifies his yetzer hara, you cannot get rid of your yetzer hara. I can't get rid of my yetzer hara. Everyone was created with a yetzer hara, an inclination to evil, as the Torah tells us. Why? Because that's what Hashem did. Hashem created you and me with a yetzer hara. It's our yetzer hara that gets us out of control, like a wild animal, steering us here, steering us there. However, the yetzer hara can be purified and can be brought and made subservient to the yetzer tov, to the inclination of good, to our soul. And so this is what is being said here. It doesn't matter how crazy, how much on spiritual steroids your yetzer hara is, it can actually be rectified. Yes, it's difficult, it's not easy, but with God all things are possible. And he says when this is done, it's transformed to good, and that person becomes mishtaresh. They become rooted b'kirusha, in the holiness, lemala, above. You have to understand, our souls don't originate from this world. Our souls originate from the world above. And therefore, when you do a tikkun in this world, it extends and vibrates all the way up to the heavenly world. this has an impact upon all the souls that are still in the world of Bria, the world of souls, as the rabbis call it. And what is that? You might think, well, Russia, I'm never gonna have children, right? I don't want my kids to be like me. That's a problem with today's day and age. People live in fear, thinking, oh, we live in the end of days. I don't want to bring kids into the world. And the idea here is the rabbis say Mashiach will not come until the goof is empty, till the body is empty, referring to the body of souls in the heavenly world in which souls come down to, and they're placed in the womb. And what the Ramach says here is that when a person does a Tikkun, it resonates all the way to the world above, which then affects any soul that's going to come through them later on in different generations, that they become completely elevated. Think about stories in the Torah, right, and the Tanakh. We see Avraham, right? Who was Avraham? He's Avraham ben Terach, right? Who was Terach? Terach was an idolater, okay? Abraham's family, they were Gentiles. But yet, from out of something impure came something pure. And what do we see from Abraham? Sure, he had Ishmael with a Hagar, but through his wife, Sarah, they had a Yitzhak. And what do we see through that? We see purity. We see David HaMelech is the grandson of Ruth, who was a convert, whose genealogy goes back to her great-great-great-great-grandfather, Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham, who had incestuous relations with his daughters during some apocalyptic scenario or scenery of destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But we see that in something like incestuous sin, eventually gives birth to the line of Mashiach. Are you kidding me? That you could take something that impure and make it pure. So it's possible. And he goes on to say here, he says, V'zochi ma'alat ha-teshuvah shahadam. This is the elevated level of Teshuvah with which a person should conduct himself with. And he says, Sarik shebachol yom vayom yacharher ba vayase. Teshuvah. Every single day, a person should contemplate this and do Teshuvah in some way, some form. Every single day. Besad ma kedei sheyuchol yemav b'Teshuvah. That way, all of his days will be spent doing Teshuvah. And so, Chavarim, what I'd like to challenge you with here, where maybe you're at, I'm not sure who I'm speaking to here today, but I understand my family are B'nai Anusim, okay? And so, when my family became part of the Anusim movement, okay, as they call it, back in Italy, I had my ancestors get involved in a lot of unkosher ordeals, a lot of unkosher things and movements. I'm not going to say anything on camera here, but they were involved in a lot of criminal stuff. I also had tasted the same thing. I understand what it's like to come from a side of holiness, emerge to a side of evil, and then to go through a tikkun process. It's possible for everyone to rectify themselves. If it was possible for Cain to make a teshuvah and rectify himself, it's possible for you and me, okay? Hashem could do anything. It doesn't matter where you're at. The problem with most people is they don't believe in themselves enough. That's another thing, is belief. Not just belief in God, but also belief in themselves. And that's something I'm going to talk about for a message I have later on for Shabbat, which is going to be focusing on a theme from this week's Torah portion, Parsha Netzavim. And so, B'ezras Hashem, with God's help, I'll discuss that later on. So for that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for taking the time out to learn with me. Another message focusing on Darchei Teshuvah and the pathway of Teshuvah. May the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your families. Shalom and Kol Tuv.